So let me make just 2 or 3 very short introductory remarks. As strange as it may sound, the big question for my generation in 1989 was somehow related to kitchen matters. We were asking ourselves all the time whether the communist omelette can be unmade, and if you wish, whether the fish soup can be turned back into aquarium. I never thought, not even in my worst dreams, that I would ask this question again, 35 years after. And now I'm asking this and asking the question whether the non-communist authoritarian omelette can be unmade. And now we have Poland and we have 2 distinguished scholars here, and I will torture them with this question, whether they want it or not. Well, we invited them, probably 2 different persons. I know Jan very well. Different generations, an emigre, let's say a domestic scholar from Poland, if this distinction make any sense today, a social historian and a cultural studies person, a cultural studies scholar, and I'm asking the same question. We will not have a formal talk here. The panelists will talk to each other, and my only task is to nudge them sometimes or being a catalyst here. We will cover 3 sets of questions. You might know that from the invitation. The first is, why and how did the ancien regime fail? The second, how strong are the intellectual and cultural legacies of that regime? And the third one is, how can or how could these legacies be deactivated? So I try to play the role of the catalyst, and sometimes probably using my local knowledge of Hungary, a country where the regime is not an ancien yet. It's very contemporary, and I would say, liberal-minded intellectuals in Hungary are desperately waiting for the express train from Warsaw to arrive, as we did it in 1956 and as we did it in 1989. Now, we will have elections next year. You will have elections very soon, presidential elections. So we have a lot of questions on the table. Now, let's get started. The first question. The first question is about the collapse, the defeat of the peace regime. You wouldn't say that it collapsed. Okay, this will be an important issue to discuss. So the question is, why did it fail? Why did the peace regime lose the elections? Did the regime implode, or was it defeated? That's an important question, because many of you would know that Jan published a book many years ago, with Stephen Kotkin about uncivil society, and they were coming up with the implosion hypothesis. Now the question is whether the peace regime imploded or exploded, or I don't know what happened to them. It is still there in certain, you will definitely say it is there. And how can we explain the failure of that regime? Cultural, political, economic. So I stop here. I give the floor first to Jan, because you published that book. So implosion or explosion or what happened, and then we go further and ask about the legacies. Please, that's your time.
Well, there is always a penalty to pay when you write something. Somebody reads it and then they call you to account on this. I must say that this is the book, the one with Steve Kotkin, who is a fantastic historian of Stalinism. And an author, as many of you may know, of a biography of Stalin, which is still in the making. His about to write the third volume of it, but I wasn't terribly happy about the take that essentially he drove as a leading author of this book. If somebody would take it in hand, you will see this is just with my collaboration. I wrote the piece on Poland, but the general thrust of it was his. But implosion, or so to speak, conquest and surrender to some outside forces. It's an interesting story. I'm generally, if one were to think about revolutions, about revolutionary changes, my intuition would be driven essentially by both the great histories of the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, that the key factor in regime transformation, radical regime transformation, is really implosion. And the same goes for the 30s in Europe. But whether this is the published situation of 2023, when peace loses power, the context is different, it seems to me. We, of course, view them, and rightly so, as very ambitious architects of just progressively less and less open and illiberal, in effect, democracy, so to speak. In other words, a regime where elections were supposed still to decide on. But it's I wouldn't think of it really as a sort of profound revolutionary-like regime change. Both peace and anti-peace forces in Poland came essentially from the same impulse of challenging the communist regimes that collapsed in 1989. All the leading politicians had roots in their activities that were very important in transforming and constructing the post-communist society in Eastern Europe, in Poland in this case. And then things happen, so to speak, as they do very often in sort of in politics. So peace, there is a history to collapse of peace regimes also. Peace regime already collapsed once in 2007, prior to collapsing in 2023. It could have been the hubris of its leader that was really the very crucial factor that played out at the time, certainly in 2007. So it's a subject matter that's interesting in itself. But as the 2023 goes, in other words, the elections of October this is really, I can't even say last year, it's beyond last year. It's a year and a half by now. I think that, in a strange way, the answer is very simple. It's very simple and very complicated at the same time, because this was a regime that had everything in its hand, in a way. After 8 years of being in power, they very deliberately and kind of cleverly set up the rules of the game in such a way that they were completely tilted. And the best measure of it perhaps being that they have infinite financial resources that were used essentially by drawing on governmental treasury, and in a variety of ways disguising it rather thinly. They are now regretting that they did it so recklessly, this whole process, but because they never thought about losing these elections, and they just went full barrel forward. What happened and what was unexpected in a way, I think, and I'm saying it a little bit like contre cœur, so to speak, because I come from a generation that was still steep in sort of Marxist pedagogy. In my youth, I was very fond of revisionist Marxism, and we, in my days, went through, had a lot of contact with Marxism, as it were, and the role of individual in history was not viewed as something of a crucial nature. There were processes, there were general phenomena, and social forces, etc., etc. And here I'm time and again in my old age confronted with the fact that in fact personality in history and in politics matters very much. So I'm going to yield the floor. In a moment, I just want to say that the key issue or key factor that brought about the change of regime in 2023 was this extraordinary political acumen and talent and energy of Donald Tusk. And if there is one person story that somehow is on my mind as somebody who could be brought in as a parallel here, as to just give you a sense how talented a politician he is. I've spent most of my life in America, and an equally talented guy that I saw was Bill Clinton. Just extraordinary political animal. Tusk turned out to be a person of that sort. And I think he was a fundamental element here. And then if one were to look at just concrete facts on the ground that happened, the other phenomenon that took place was the turnout. Very unusual for Poland. 74% of people eligible to vote went to vote. I have a little trepidation, so to speak. This is because Tusk, to a large extent, was able to mobilize them, of course. But he was successful in it. And so if I were to say, Janos, in just a very kind of simplified manner, it's the turnout and Tusk. This is what you need in Hungary.
No. Let's hear the cultural sociology.
Yes.
Okay. Is this okay? Yeah. Yes, the turnout was 10% or more, even I think 12% higher than on June 4th, 1989, where of course we can say that we still were not used to the democratic process actually working. So, but it always surprises me when I think of 1989 that it was so few people who actually turned out for the elections, right? So maybe before I answer that question, and yes, I think I'll still be in the kind of more Marxist big forces school at this point. I'd like to make one connection between what you began with, so the turning the leaving communism or dismantling communism and its authoritarianism, if you want to use that word, because it's very interesting for me that the difference between when peace came to power in 2005 and when it came to power in 2014, 15? 8 years, was one of the reasons was that in 2015 they clearly discursively established themselves as a revolutionary force. And one of these very clear narrative lines that they proposed, and not only in terms of discourse, but in terms of politics itself, was that we are the first true agents of post-communist transition. The post-socialist transition was a sham. It didn't happen. I don't know what they were doing between 1989 and 2015, but okay, they make this statement that Poland still needs to be decommunized. One of the first bills that they introduced was the decommunization bill, which was a bill that forced local governments to dismantle very different types of monuments, from Dziga Wiertów in Białystok through gratitude to Russian army monuments, Rosa Luxemburg, of course, and so on and so on. And they really kind of tried to emphasize the fact that they are the true revolutionary spirit. In a sense, the way they, of course, we know that it was all in their interest, but the way they talked about the judiciary changes also kind of was played into that narrative, right? So this was a space that for them needed to be cleaned of these communists, post-communists, and so on and so on. So of course it was kind of faux anti-communist discourse, but I think it's important to notice that they really kind of used this parallel, establishing themselves as the revolutionaries. And I think you can only do that for some time, right? And that one of the reasons why they didn't win this election was the fact, simply, this is a kind of larger view, was that recently, the past 2 years, the past post-COVID, post-pandemic years, were in different countries, in different political settings, were a time of abolishing those who were in power. So the incumbent parties, right? I think that there were very many things that worked against peace. It was their handling of COVID. It was inflation, it was the economy, right? It's the economy, stupid, and so on. It was, of course, women's rights. So there's really a lot of factors that I think for different groups of voters played a very important role. The women turnout in these elections, and the fact that women's rights groups were perhaps one of the most successful campaigners on the campaign trail, trying to convince people to go out and vote, young women to go out and vote, right? Because this is something that's not very obvious for the young generation, again, globally, not only in Poland. So I think it was many different factors that led to the victory of the coalition. Also, I mean, you mentioned the turnout, but the fact is also that, of course, we can speculate, right? But Donald Tusk's party won also, in a sense, as a part of a coalition, right? It was the party that gained the most amount of votes. I think you have the results. Yes, 37% exactly, and then, but combined with the other parties, right? So the so-called Third Way and the New Left, which won 9% of votes. So that enabled them to take over the government and form a coalition. So I think if there is something to be learned from 1989, it's also the fact that I am very cautious, or we should be very cautious, I think, in Poland about repeating this sort of discourse of unity, right? This discourse of society that spoke out against an authoritarian or authoritarian regime, simply because maybe the results weren't razor thin, but they were still pretty thin, right? So this is something I think that discursively wasn't very well played after 1989, and one of the groups that peace appealed to were specifically those groups that perhaps felt left out by the transition project, or didn't feel as being seen, didn't feel as being addressed, and so on.
When I was asking about implosion, then I wanted to know whether the system itself, I mean the regime, was disintegrating or decomposing or getting tired in a sense. So did they show some signs of weakness on themselves? So it's not just the glorious revolution, which, I don't know, toppled them, but something else, some kind of, okay, we are tired of you, something. I'm not talking as the Polish people. So now I'm asking about this internal, sometimes spontaneous decomposition, which usually precedes such changes. Now, this is question one. The other one is that I was a little bit surprised that you said that everything was in Kaczynski's hands. Seen from Hungary, Kaczynski was a kind of, the Kaczynski regime was a kind of garden variety of Orbanism. And did he have the money? Did he have the police and the army on his side? Did he have a kind of quasi-totalitarian surveillance and control over the society? So, seen from Hungary, Kaczynski was not a professional, as Orban is, in a sense, and therefore more dangerous. This is the second question. And the third one is about the economy. You mentioned that, the economy is stupid. No, we are with Clinton. But yes, Poland is a success story of the transition. And so what is the problem with the economy which somehow contributed to the failure of the regime? What segments of the economy or what features of that economy? A very continuously growing economy, structurally even modernizing, and so I don't want to go into, praising Poland. I'm very envious again as a Hungarian about the economic performance of your country. But why do you say that it was the economy? Sorry, we will soon open up the discussion for you as well.
Yeah. Janusz, again, my apologies. I observe it from a distance. I don't live in Poland. Occasionally I come to Poland, but so this is mediated through the media, literally, a set of observations. It's not grounded in experience, but it seems to me that economy is not as important an issue in Poland as perhaps it is in Hungary, and that a kind of an economic transformation that Orban, and correct me, to my mind, what he had done is to create essentially an oligarchy. In other words, to enable a group of people who were his political allies or whom he obliged to be his political allies in exchange for access and opportunity. It's a kind of a model that one saw in Russia. This has not happened in Poland, it seems to me. In other words, I don't know why Kaczynski may be less interested in money than Orban. He may have less of an extensive family than Orban. God knows. I mean, he has a very good life. He doesn't know what money is in the sense that everything is paid for by entourage, by the party, whatever the party provides. But this is not his. He's not in. I mean, his obsession is politics. He fails in it miserably, incidentally. But this is what constantly is preoccupied. So they did not create a layer of oligarchs. They were just stealing money, so to speak, or appropriating money from the state treasury, essentially the tax money, in ways that were too often imprudent. I say too often imprudent because now there is a threshold moment when a lot of them will be charged, some have been already, and essentially for embezzlement in some ways. It's not embezzlement that when you put money into your own pocket, but essentially a kind of a illegal use of public money for party interests, mainly. But I think they also benefited too. But not on a scale. You didn't have this Orban phenomenon there. This is... so in that sense, I think, from a Hungarian perspective, Kaczynski is not a professional. This is a much more stable environment, obviously, to create a subclass of oligarchs. I mean, if you can keep them on a leash in some way. I mean, Putin essentially kills people if they don't deliver. I don't know whether Orban has done it on its, but how he keeps them. But so we'll see how stable it is. All right. So.
Okay. So maybe say something about the economy argument, which I don't think. I would agree that it maybe doesn't refer to or apply to what could be called the political class. I think the system here is very different, or was very different than in Russia and in Hungary. Although you also had this talk of kind of these boards of state enterprises, right, which were filled by wives of politicians and so on and so on. So in a sense, of course, there was also that kind of transfer of money. But what I meant about the economy and relating to your observation about, there's this idea of Poland being a green island of prosperity, and of course it checks out when you look at some data, and then it doesn't when you look at other data. So of course it checks out when you look at the GDP, and then it doesn't check out when you go deeper into the more important data, I think, in terms of electoral politics, which is inequality levels. Krytyka Polityczna, publisher that many of you probably know, recently published a book titled Inequalities in Poland. And they use a very the authors use an extended base of data that compiles not only the data that is readily available, which is pay levels, but also I'm missing the word in English now. Majątek. Wealth, right? Wealth and property and other types of wealth, and they use different sorts of data. I'm not even qualified to go into this, but I generally trust them. And the book was reviewed and received good reviews, also by, you could say, kind of mainstream liberal economists. And they show actually that the inequality levels in Poland are high. They're much higher than they're the highest from the so-called kind of success stories. Of course, they're not as high as in countries such as Bulgaria or Romania, but generally what we thus far considered as the kind of inequality levels, when you account for extra data, they turn out much bigger. And I think you can clearly see this in relation to peace, because peace in 2015 had this very bold idea in terms of the way in which economy was taught and the way in which economy was perceived in Poland, which was to introduce a social transfer to everyone. Actually, it was not even the 500 plus, which then turned into 800 plus policy, was a policy that was also that was projected in terms of demography, right? So it was a social transfer for families with 2 children and then with 1 child, but it made a huge difference. And again, you can see this in the data. I mean, it lifted thousands of families, thousands of children out of poverty. So I think you can really see how such economic decisions have a very quick effect on politics, and what potentially killed peace this time, I would say, of course, rising inequality and this kind of perceived processes of acquiring wealth through politics. I think it this really did get to people, even if it's not on a scale comparable to Russia, for example. I think it was something annoying. I mean, the fact when you found out how much these board members earn and so on. But also very down-to-earth things, so rising costs of living, and I would say perhaps most importantly, the housing crisis, which has exploded in Poland over the past few years. And for such a kind of government claiming to care about the working classes and the lower middle classes, one could say, the only idea that PiS had was to help people get a loan, right? So that was, which further raised the prices on the housing market and so on and so on. So far, I think the new government hasn't done anything in this regard, and it's kind of interesting to see how this will play out in relation to the next elections, because no one seems to have a good idea of how to solve these things. Specifically, I think if someone really efficiently was able to address the housing crisis, at least partially, then they would just get votes blindly, no matter if they were right-wing or left-wing or center-left or whatever.
I just want to add some what needs to be added into the picture, because it's an extremely important element of this whole process of collapse of peace, and that element is women. That's what mobilized and created a very powerful message that undermined the peace regime. In other words, the law which has essentially prevented women from having abortion under almost any circumstances, to the point that there were several cases of women who died in hospitals because doctors were afraid to perform termination of pregnancy at the moment when they had very sick fetuses, before there could be demonstrated that these fetuses died already. And Kaczynski, who just said all kinds of crazy things, that if you have a pregnancy that's demonstrated to be untenable, the fetus has deep biological sort of flaws and will die very soon, etc. You still have to give birth just so that child or whatever would be born in whatever form, so to speak, could be Christianed and then buried. So there were women were an extraordinarily powerful force in the drive to get rid of this regime, which was beholden to the most absurd and conservative elements in the church. In a way, it turned out in the process of it just happened. Not that that Kaczynski himself is such a devout Catholic. It was pure calculation, and that was a very important element, in addition to this perception that all the families of these guys, that they are just trying to use the state as a source of personal income. But what I meant is the difference with Hungary. It seems to me, yes, they used the state companies as a source of reward, and this was egregious. This is constantly one would find in the media stories about it. But this is different, it seems to me, from what Orban does, where he creates a class of these powerful capitalists, actually, and Putin as well. So anyway, I wanted to put women into the equation because they were really a driving force. And I no, these are facts, so to speak. I mean, we owe them a lot in Poland.